This is Rodina Abda with Urban Nibbles, and today I'm joined by Daniel Haufschild, who is a principal at Arab Canada leading planning. Welcome, Daniel.
Morning, Rodina. Good to be with you.
Great to have you here. Today we're going to talk about transportation and a sector that's been very much impacted by shutdown, pandemic, COVID. And we're starting to see with a lot of changes now emerging as people start going back to some routines and some mobility. So just to start off with, can we touch on some of the macro issues that we've seen impacting COVID, such as on one part, we've seen some benefits, the environment congestion, probably it's largely gone. And lots of mode shifts move towards bicycle use and non-motorized mobility in a localized fashion. But can you just put us in the picture as to what you're seeing macro-wise and what's happened during pandemic and what we're starting to see as we start to emerge from lockdown or strict lockdown measures?
Yeah, sure. We're sort of at an interesting period, and I feel we're at a sort of a bit of an inflection point where the last few months have been really kind of shock and awe in terms of people reacting and trying to get their head around the challenges that we're facing. And I think a lot over the last few months, what we've seen is a lot of what I would call spitballing on solutions, where people are without a lot of information trying to think about what could be measures to improve, and I think the evidence behind some of those are probably a bit questionable, but we are, I think, shifting to a period. What's really, I think, galvanized people at the moment is this kind of the September timeframe and the kind of return to work, and I am seeing a big shift to kind of a bit lost in the woods to actually coming down to action and planning for that time frame and really trying to put plans in place. And I think the difference is we have a bit more information. We still don't have a lot of good hard data, but we have people are starting to piece together the bits and pieces that they need, both in terms of understanding travel behavior and the changes that have been, but also the types of measures that they think might be useful in the next phase. What strikes me over the next year is that we're going to be planning and in planning and engineering, safety standards, evidence-based is paramount. And we're in this interesting period where we won't have full information and we'll have to make choices that have real consequences in terms of health impacts that we'll have to be comfortable with. And so it's an interesting, both uncomfortable, but also there's an opportunity there to really do things differently because we have to.
Mm-hmm. I guess this whole reactive mode that we were in the last 3 months and now being more deliberate, perhaps. Can you talk about some specifics of things that you're dealing with?
So globally, we're seeing variations in ridership, although in North America, pretty consistently at 10 or 20% of previous ridership. But I think the social equity lens really becomes clear in that the ridership levels are very different depending on who you are and where you are. So for example, the subways in Toronto saw a drop to 15% of previous ridership, so 85% drop in ridership, versus the more suburban buses that are down to about 30%, so quite a lot higher ridership currently than the subways. And I think that speaks to, subways attract a large portion of office workers. The suburban neighborhoods are where you see some of the more disadvantaged people that are more captive to transit in this case.
Sorry. I was going to say this whole social equity theme seems to be a common thread emerging on so many fronts, whether it's housing, transportation, education, connectivity. What are there measures being taken to balance this social inequity that we're seeing now? Can you see decision making moving towards, okay, we know what we need to do, time to actually change things?
Yeah, a colleague of mine said it well the other day. The social equities move from a moral issue to a social issue, in the sense that COVID has laid bare how much we depend on each other and the linkages between all of us. So I think it's really raised the awareness. And for example, I participated in a roundtable in Toronto between the Board of Trade and the Urban Land Institute, where we had 8 tables across retail, civic, education, transportation, office, and a cross-cutting theme in that environment was social equity. So I think it's very much top of mind, and I think rightfully so. I think what we found is not that the equity lens hasn't been there. You know, certainly in public transport they account for it. I think it's more the consistency, the priority of it, and the deliberateness of it that is a bit different. And I think regionally trying to think about what are we trying to achieve and what the goals. So that was one of our recommendations coming out of our roundtables, is really just being a bit more deliberate about it. And actually McGill University just did a report literally today on social equity, where they looked at the responses to different transit systems, and it's interesting to see how different operators respond in different cities across North America. And the way they think of it is kind of vertical versus horizontal. So the vertical is, do you focus on, if you're making service changes in the context of, you know, financial stress, are you focused on trying to maintain and provide services to those who most need it, versus horizontal, which is more about trying to maintain the overall network and service to everyone. And that's one of the, you know, trade-offs and ways of looking at the problem.
I'd like to talk a little bit about modes, and I was in a webinar yesterday where somebody talked about bicycles being the new toilet paper. As far as good luck in trying to get one. There's such a rush on ordering bicycles, so good news on the mobility side, and potential. And on the other hand, I've also been reading about an uptick in car ownership, or putting orders on cars so that you've got single vehicles, and a move away from public transportation, which would also be not detrimental to a lot of city operations. Can you talk a little bit about that as far as the trends that we're seeing? And maybe it's, as you said earlier, it's not, we don't have the data yet. It's too soon to know what's going on and for the longevity of things, but decisions that could be made now on the social equity part in particular.
I mean, in transportation planning, a lot of our work is centered around understanding people's behavior and the choices they make. And you know, to date, a lot of the focus in my industry is about, you know, trying to get people to consider and use other modes to have a more balanced system as a whole. And what's interesting about COVID is it both makes that harder and easier at the same time. It's harder now because we have a new set of things that affect people's choices. So the perceptions about safety on the system, perceptions about crowding, there's a new set of factors that we have to think about in terms of how people make choices. By the same token, I think it's much easier because one of the realities of walking, cycling, transit, and auto use is people are creatures of habit. And COVID's been fantastic at getting people out of their habits and trying new things. And I think for example, with cycling, people may have cycled when they were in their youth and then kind of left it behind, and now they're suddenly finding it's actually quite useful. And so I think there's a distinct opportunity as people both get accustomed to it, and have the bikes, and as equally as we're transforming our cities and providing more space for cycling. That's certainly one element that hopefully will stick in the long term going forward.
Because a lot of cities are moving towards reallocation of travel lanes to bike lanes. Are these being considered as interim measures, or do you think there are going to be TISs will start looking in favor of doing these things, and bikes serving the last mile and serving the local areas?
I actually think COVID is mostly accelerating things that were already planned. So I think most things will be largely, I mean, some are purposely planned as temporary, but I think a lot of them were ideas that have been around. And I think one of the things we realized in discussion again in the Board of Trade and ULI is a lot of the solutions for COVID. I think what we discovered is the problems are kind of pre-existing conditions. So it's not that COVID adds a new lens, specific challenges, but the stresses on the system are revealing things that we already know about.
Mm-hmm.
And equally, the solutions that we need are already known and in many cases planned, but we haven't had the will and ambition to kind of roll them out. So it's sort of what I describe the tyranny. In the past we suffered from the tyranny of incrementalism, where we take kind of baby steps just so because we don't want to upset any entrenched views or interests, and in a way the opportunity of COVID is it really upset that apple cart of expectations, and we can kind of think about what are our priorities and make informed choices. So I think again, there's a great opportunity to accelerate what's been planned and make it permanent.
Mm-hmm. And in the interim, whether pre-post vaccine and with the current lockdown measures that are likely to sustain a year and a half, and the financial implications on operations, on revenue of these transit systems, do you think they're threatened to not be able to continue their plans, and how will they prevail moving forward?
Yeah, I'm both optimistic with a slight tinge of concern. I've been optimistic because transit's been surprisingly robust in the conversations in terms of people valuing transit. If you think back when, about 4 or so years ago, when we saw transport network companies like Uber and Lyft come to the market and other services, there was, for a year or two, there was discussion is transit obsolete? Why are we investing in all these large fixed infrastructure? That's the past. That hasn't happened in the context of COVID, which is almost surprising at some level. And I think part of that is just the reality. It's a math problem. We live in urban areas. I think what we really discovered with our Asia experience is density is not the issue, and mass transit's not necessarily the issue either. So I think we've optimistically people they're concerned about transit, but in the near term, but transit seems healthy in terms of the public perception. The concern that I have is more over the next year or two is on the operating side. Because there are substantial ridership, if you lost 10 or 20% of your ridership, that's a lot of revenue that's left. And I think it's even more of a problem in Canada than, say, for example, the US. In Canada, the major systems typically recover 60, 70, 80% of their operating costs through the fare box, and the US tends to be 10, 20, 30%. So the more riders we lose in Canada, the more it hurts. So for example, the TTC in Toronto, the Toronto Transit Commission, they're currently losing about $20 million a week. And if you do the math and factor that up, that's approaching $1 billion. If that trend continues, $1 billion over the next year. So whatever that number is, and we can debate the numbers, but there's a significant long-term challenge, and it's twofold. One is there's going to be a sustained period where they'll need subsidy or larger subsidy. But the big challenge is just because you have fewer riders doesn't mean you have lower costs. So again, the TTC looks at 20% of the riders take about 70% of the service hours. And once you're up to 30% of riders, you pretty much have to operate 100% of your service hours. And basically that reflects it's a network. And if you're social distancing and you're having reduced capacity on vehicles, you need more vehicles. So there is this dilemma where you're carrying fewer people, but it's costing you more, and that's going to go on for another year or two. And I think that's the next shoe to drop. And I think there are going to be some pretty stark discussions, I would say, later this year as people really understand the scale of it.
What about the
optimistic and slightly worried?
What about the different systems working together? Rail, TTC, buses, all of that, the integration on a systems perspective, transfers, how are the agencies talking to each other, and are they trying to figure it out collectively?
Yeah, I think there's been, what I have observed that I've been impressed by the agility of government and getting on with it. So it's kind of restoring confidence and public trust, I think, has been important. So I think there's good collaboration there. One of the opportunities that in a regional network where we have multiple public operators and also private operators, historically, one of our big challenges has been both fare integration, where, you know, if you cross a boundary in Toronto, you suddenly either have a double fare, or, you know, you might only go a few hundred meters and you're, you know, and you're suddenly so those boundary issues have historically added cost. And equally, the services is integration has been a, you know, how do you align services properly? And I think COVID's, we've made incremental progress, but a big barrier to service integration has been cost and who pays for it. And in my mind, because our cost structure and our operating and revenue structure has been so devastated, it makes the fare integration problem almost easier, because it's such a smaller scale of it is now different. So I think that's one nugget that I'm hoping the collaboration will take forward. And then the other one is kind of a new model of public and private operators. So again, that's been incremental over the last few years, but now I think the question is really where do the public operators have the most benefit, and where do things like the on-demand services kind of fill in the gaps in a more meaningful way. And I think critically is what's going to be important is the integration in terms of the user experience, because you need to be safe from your house to wherever you're going more so than ever. And that experience can't change when you shift from one operator to the other. So things around communicating the measures they're taking to keep you safe is important, but equally information to inform your choices, like you know, how crowded things are, how the services are running, are important. So that integration across the full journey is something that we've worked on in the past, but COVID just really makes more critical.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great thing. And then what about within the design within networks, whether it's the cars or the stations? Are we seeing anything innovative or differences coming up now or being planned for?
Within the stations, we are looking at so, for example, within Arup, we've developed, we look at pedestrian modeling, tools for how people flow through space. So historically, and you know, we do this in stations and airports and art galleries and shopping malls, which is really, you know, wherever you have large amounts of people, how do you move through space effectively? How do you eliminate choke points, safety, and the user experience? What we've added in the meantime is proximity analysis, so we can look at spaces and figure out not just where congestion is, but if we're trying to maintain certain, you know, 2 meter separation, or where are we able to achieve that, where we're not. And that's a tool we've been using to inform design. So how do we need to change space to accommodate the volumes that we need? And COVID, social distancing just amplifies the space you need. But because it's a short-term measure, you know, this is kind of my colleague Malcolm Smith in the UK talks about urban overlays, with this idea of how do you have a temporary situation in terms of operations or infrastructure that may come and go depending on your need. And this is based on kind of the Olympics experience, right? What are the things that are permanent, and how do you operate differently for a specific set of time? So in the context of COVID, if you're in a stress environment, are there operational changes you can make that it might go several months but eventually disappear? So we're also looking, you know, for example, one-way flows, or how people are queuing, and how to change the operations of stations to make people be safer and feel safer.
Mm-hmm. So this could have long-lasting and be actually beneficial for the user experience in the long term.
Yeah, I think a big theme is this idea about flexible spaces. Because we're going to have to ramp up and ramp down in the future. So how do we plan spaces that are a bit more nimble? And I think an interesting challenge is, you know, COVID doesn't stop at property boundaries. And so this public and public-private planning, and how do we, you know, there is a need for greater collaboration, because it's a little harder to stop at your boundary. And, you know, just at a very simplistic level, you see, like, you know, retail stores where people are queuing out onto the street, entrances to office towers, you know, where the entrances, where the plazas are, space suddenly and boundaries matter a huge amount now, and being able to collaborate to remove those boundaries is increasingly important.
So how we regulate that is going to be put to the test, and maybe time for change for these things. Well, I'm going to close with a question that I ask everybody, and it is moving forward, now that we are in this mindset of thinking of doing things differently and having to do things differently in pandemic mode, moving forward when we don't have to, when we don't have these stressors at hand, what is at risk of being left behind that really should be carried forward, whether it's in our philosophy or practice, the way we go about doing things in transportation planning? And I would say the flip to that is also what is more than likely to be carried forward that really should be left behind?
So maybe two things. I think ambition and maybe social equity. What strikes me, we're in this moment where we can seize the opportunity, and even though we're deep in it at the minute, there's already, I think, even the last week, more optimistic signs that a vaccine may be on the horizon. 6 months to a year. They're in trials in the UK. And we're very much creatures of habit, and I would say my worry is say it's a year from now, we find a vaccine and then we just go back to normal. We kind of forget the lessons learned. So to me, that's the big challenge. I'd like us to push forward on social equity. I think COVID has revealed the stresses in our system, and I think of COVID as a dress rehearsal for climate. Or whatever stress for that matter. So if we can get our thinking and planning around social equity stronger, I think that will, after COVID, it's going to keep us in good shape for future stresses, and climate justice in particular is kind of the big thing in the background that we've kind of left for the moment because of the immediate focus on COVID. The second one, I think in COVID we discovered we can be, government can be agile, we can be ambitious, we can be bold, and I'd like to. I think I mentioned earlier, it'd be great if we can kind of stay away from the tyranny of incrementalism and just be bold and make deliberate choices that are kind of evidence-based and in the public interest to make the best use of space and resources. So I'm hopeful we can kind of take lessons learned and just push them forward.
Well, thank you. And I'm really happy to end on this hopeful note: social equity, environmental justice, and being bold in making lasting good decisions. Thank you very much, Daniel.
Thank you, Rodena.
For this conversation.
Be well. Thank you.
Bye-bye.